Bienvenidas al diálogo de resiliencia con perspectiva de género y socialmente equitativa. Estamos a punto de empezar, esperando que se una todo el grupo y ya pronto empezaremos y daremos instrucciones sobre la traducción simultánea. Very welcome everyone to this dialogue. We're just waiting another minute or two to get started. But meanwhile, we wish to welcome you. Thanks for being here. And in a minute or so, we'll also be giving you instructions about the translation, the simultaneous translation that's going to be happening. So let's just wait for a few seconds and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we might get started. So let me ask our interpreters to give us a few indications of how this will be how this will work. Vamos a empezar entonces y le voy a dar la palabra a nuestros intérpretes que nos van a guiar al proceso de la traducción y de cómo escoger el canal que le corresponda. Gracias. María Angélica, Gina.
Hola, yo soy Gina y mi cointérprete es María Angélica y estaremos interpretando este evento en español e inglés. Hi, my name is Gina and my co-interpreter is María Angélica and we'll be interpreting this event in Spanish and English. Creamos los espacios multilingües en conjunto, así que no hable demasiado rápido, sea consciente de la accesibilidad para todos, un solo micrófono o persona a la vez. Si usted es bilingüe, por favor, no cambie de idioma en medio de una frase y no sufra en silencio si tiene problemas en entender o escuchar. Desactive su micrófono para que no hayan ecos o ruido de fondo. Favor de hablar en una velocidad moderada. Recuerde que se está realizando interpretación. Presentadores, favor de mantener en mente su velocidad, especialmente cuando está leyendo algo, ya que entendemos hablar hasta más rápido cuando leemos. We create multilingual spaces together, so don't go too fast. Be mindful of accessibility for all. One mic, one voice. If you're bilingual, please don't switch languages mid-sentence. Don't suffer in silence if you're having problems understanding or listening. Mute when you're not speaking so there aren't any echoes or background noises. Speak at a moderate pace. Remember that interpretation is occurring. Presenters, please be mindful of your pace, especially when reading aloud, as we tend to speak even faster when reading. La función de interpretación ya está activada. Si usted está usando una computadora, el símbolo de un globo verá un símbolo de un globo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Haga clic en el globo y seleccione el idioma que habla. Si usted es bilingüe, puede escoger audio original. Si está usando un teléfono o una tableta, va a haber 3 puntitos en la parte de abajo al lado derecho de su pantalla. Haga clic ahí, haga clic en interpretación de idiomas y seleccione el idioma que habla. Si por alguna razón el audio original suena más fuerte que la voz del intérprete, en cualquier momento puede silenciar el audio original. The interpretation feature is now active. If you're using a computer, you'll see a globe icon on the bottom right hand of the screen. Click on the globe and select the language you speak. If you're bilingual, you can choose original audio. If you're on your phone or on your tablet, you'll see 3 dots on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Click on those, click on Language Interpretation, and then select the language you speak. If for some reason the original speaker sounds louder than the interpreter you are listening to, you can mute the original audio at any moment. Thank you. Gracias.
Muy bien. Well, thank you very much. Mara, should we move on to the house rules?
Absolutely. Thanks all. My name is Mara. It's spelled M-A-R-A. You can find me in the chat box at any time. You can send me a private message or you can email me throughout the whole meeting. I'm also dropping my email in the chat. And I'm serving as accessibility coordinator. So if anything comes up during the call or even after the call around how we can make this conversation more accessible to you, whatever that may mean for you, please just let me know and I'll do the best I can. So please, again, you can either private message me or email me. My name is Mara. Thanks all.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get started. Cesar, let me just give you a final reminder on that house rule there. Just, I think we are all now used to this process, but make sure that you have muted your microphone when you're not speaking, that your camera is off as well, except of course when we are in the panelists and if you are a panelist.
Une panelista, remueve toda.
It's a very useful tool, which we always keep in our hands. Maybe we can put it a bit further away for the next couple of hours and use a chatbot for communication or raise your hand. And more important, more than anything, perhaps make yourself comfortable and hopefully this will be a very interesting moment and space for everyone. Thank you. All right, so in getting started, if we go to the first one, Cesar, please. Let me just tell you, my name is Daniel Morchain, and I am with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I'm very happy to see so many people present here today, because we're here today to discuss topics that I think are close to all of our hearts, right? That's why we're here. These topics in today's discussions will include issues around gender equality, social justice, resilience, and climate action. And as you have seen probably in the description of this event, we are really looking at that and placing it all under the umbrella or under the philosophy of leave no one behind. And I would say that in doing that, we are already suggesting an exercise of rethinking how all of these elements around gender equality, resilience, and so on, how they have to be done differently, right? In order to achieve this goal that has not been achieved to date, fully in any case. So, and I think also being here, it also means that we probably all think that there is room to do more work for gender equality, for social justice, for resilience, for climate action, that there is room to do it better, not only what we do, but how we do it, how we make it better, how we make it have more impact. There's a lot of room for that. Those are the things we want to explore today. How do we get there? In getting there, I will suggest that some of the things that may be coming out in the conversation will have to do with displaying new styles of leadership, new styles of governance, new ways of collaboration, right? So today we are proposing a lot of things, and we're saying that a lot of things have to change in order to get to that better place, that more just place. And in order to have that conversation, we've brought together really a fantastic panel, a fantastic set of experts who will share their experiences from the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm really excited and thankful for them having shared their time, for being here. I'm really excited of what we're going to be hearing in the next couple of hours. So we're going to get to that. Let me say one more thing also, that we are recording. So this is going to be a recording. It'll be available afterwards as well, but also be informed that this is being recorded. So thanks for that. And before we move on then to the initial words from our climate champion and then the panel, we will jump and get you already active into a Mentimeter. So I think most of you are familiar with that, but Mara will also give us now the instructions or just help us with the shifting the screen, sharing the screen to let us know how we already, the big group that is sitting around this table, can start contributing to the discussion. So if you are not familiar with Mentimeter, simply go to your phone. Okay, now bring it back. I have mentioned put it away, but now bring it back, or your computer, and go to menti.com. And when you click there, you will just have a screen where you will be asked to enter a code. And please enter then the numbers that you see now in the screen. These numbers are 5190813. Now, when you enter that code, you will see this question, and you will please start like somebody has already done, answering this question in English, in Spanish, whatever you prefer. And the question is, what is a key lesson from the pandemic towards resilience and gender responsive climate action? So what have we learned so far from the pandemic that will help us get to a place where we undertake resilience and climate action in a way that is more gender responsive, right? So we're starting to see some answers here. I'll be quiet for a few seconds to let you concentrate and input your ideas. There's no wrong answer, of course, and there's sky's the limit. I'll give you just a few more seconds and then try to make sense of this word cloud that is forming. Okay, please do keep sharing your thoughts, but meanwhile, this is a bit of a tough word cloud. If you're familiar with word clouds, they normally have more prominent, but here we have a lot of words, mostly or partly because we are having input in two different languages. But I think having said that, there's also some clarity. And we're talking here about the importance of being inclusive. We're talking about the importance of feminist leadership, food security, intersectionality. Interesting that comes there as a big word, intersectionality. So we have to care about issues, beyond just gender, but also understand the quite complicated world that we all occupy as a person, right? We're not just man or woman, but we are, or non-binary gender, but we are also many other things. What religion we have, what kind of a cultural background we have, religion, so on. All of these matters, right? As well. Social protection, social justice, empathy, very nice, that comes up there. Fairness, equality. So thank you so much for that. And Mara, I will ask you to jump us to the second and last question at this moment. So if you refresh your page, maybe it did it automatically. Here is the second question where we would like to get your feedback. So the question is, in what ways can principles of resilience support equity and diversity in climate action, right? So how can these principles, now we're talking about principles, we talked about important principles in the previous slide. How can these help support equity and diversity in climate action? This is probably a question for a good 20 minutes answer. I know it's not an easy one at all, but yeah, let's see what you have to say. I'll give you 30 seconds and then we'll make a quick comment. Okay, I'll jump in again. Here we have a diversity, massive diversity of ideas. And I think that in itself is a great answer, because that is in fact one of the things that needs to happen. There's not just one solution, one way forward. There's not 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. There's many, many, many. And that, I think, is one of the ideas that we will be exploring a bit later. How do we make sure that all these ideas have access to the important space of decision making, right? And here's, I think, something that we're already seeing in front of us. But let me focus here. Look how beautiful. Yeah, you have this empowerment of people, indigenous rights, democracy, local action, equity, and so many more ideas that are central to what we're talking about here. So thanks again for your input on this. Much appreciated. And let's move on then to the next one, Cesar, if you will. We'll be sharing the slide quite briefly. We had to make a small change of piloting of this machinery. And there, we're getting there. Okay. So before we jump into the discussion, just a quick couple of words about the organizations that are putting together this event. And it's a collaboration between the Women and Gender Constituency and the IISD, as I mentioned. The Women and Gender Constituency was founded in 2009 as an observer constituency to the UNFCCC. A couple of years later, it was granted a full observer status. About 5 years ago, it launched the Gender Just Climate Solutions Award Program. And here you can see some really nice photos about this whole process. And this year, as of this year, there are 32 member organizations to the Women and Gender Constituency with official accreditation to the UNFCCC, plus a hosted advocacy network of over 500 groups and individuals. So really a tremendous force in pushing women's rights and gender equality in the whole UNFCCC process and beyond. So WGC Women Gender Constituency is a partner in this, and we're very proud to be partnering with them. And if we go to the next one, Cesar, just to say a couple of words about our own organization, which is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And we ourselves, we host the NAP Global Network, the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, in which gender is a clear priority of the work we do. Gender is central and is at the heart really of all the work that we're doing in trying to push forward adaptation and resilience efforts. And we provide technical support to countries. We facilitate peer-to-peer learning, develop knowledge products on gender responsive NAP processes. Here's more information on our work that you can see there. So this is us. Let's go to the next, Cesar. And that's me, again, not only me, but my fantastic, wonderful dog, Mulia, that you can see there in the photo. This is why I'm here, and I'll be moderating the event. And I also wanted to, more importantly, give really just a quick shout to my colleagues, because as you know, all of these events, they take a big team to put together and to put together successfully. So just let me mention, I'll mention by first name just because of time, but from the Women and Gender Constituency, we have Bridget, we have Mara, Malio, Patricia, really working hard on this process. From our side of the IISD, there is Angie and there's Cesar as well behind the cameras, and also our two fantastic interpreters, Maria Angelica and Gina. So this is the team that is trying to make this a good interaction today. Cesar, if we may go to the next one. And without further ado, I'm also very thrilled to share this space with Gonzalo Muñoz, who is the climate champion for COP25. Gonzalo has perhaps the easiest title of today, but certainly not the easiest job. So Gonzalo, over to you to help us frame this a little bit more, perhaps also in the context of the Race to Zero dialogues. And thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and many thanks for the invitation. And of course, thanks to both the International Institute for Sustainable Development and Women and Gender Constituency and all their partners for making this dialogue happen. I would like to go through mostly three main points. So first point would be in relation to climate action and the imperative of leaving no one behind, and absolutely and especially women. Nigel, my fellow champion and friend from the UK, and I think it is absolutely essential to take action on resilience and mitigation. It's not an either, it's both. And that we know hasn't been that clear in the past. We want to say it once and again because it's important to position both at the same level of relevancy and start acting according to that. Because we know that it's absolutely unacceptable to let the prediction of 100 million more people, and I bet it is more women than men, being pushed into extreme poverty from climate change by 2030 become true. That's we have a moral imperative to avoid that as a possibility. And during this critical year, COVID has also demonstrated what happens when we don't anticipate and prepare for risk. We have been measuring and managing risk very poorly, and we must learn from this and build resilience to climate change in all of our areas, sectors, and institutions. We have also seen how communities and women have been at the forefront of solutions to helping people cope with the impacts of the pandemic. So again, in the pandemic, women are mostly affected, and many times the solutions are so well related to gender aspects. So as champions, we're working to put resilience and adaptation as a priority alongside mitigation. That's why we plan a campaign on resilience to be called Race for Resilience as a sister campaign to a Race to Zero. So quick advert, Nigel and I will share more of our thinking on Race for Resilience in a dialogue next Tuesday 17th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. GMT. So hopefully all of you or many of you will be there. The second point is on voice and empowerment for just transition, in involving communities and everyone, especially women, in transformative solution is not a nice to have. Again, it's a must. I personally have learned from my work with Triciclos here in Latin America on transforming waste management by engaging waste pickers. And that inclusiveness is not only a moral principle, but by far the most effective strategy to achieve impact and build resilience. And I also have learned that in the majority of cases, women are much more reliable than men when addressing resilience. Or the best cases that we have in all of the countries that we work are led by women. So we need to actively involve the women and vulnerable communities from the very beginning in designing and implementing solutions. And we must ensure, of course, that they are directly getting the resources needed to implement these solutions. So let's be clear, this is not just about participation and inviting people to meetings to listen. It's about empowerment and seeing women as agents of change. The third point that I would like to focus on is on action and pathways to 1.5 degrees resilient world. Having countries working with non-state actors to implement the Paris Agreement is crucial. And we must all work, of course, for a successful outcome at COP26 in Glasgow. So for that to happen, we need to see disruptive transformations in key sectors. That is why with Nigel, working with all the Marrakesh Partnership, we are promoting the sectorial pathways launched on Monday to drive action and transform our systems. We are very pleased to have one concrete pathways on resilience, and also while also encouraging resilience among all other sectors of climate action. So that's part of what we're extremely proud of. Let me give you one example on what these pathways are trying to transform in when it comes to our broken food and agriculture system, something absolutely close to my heart as a farmer working on dry farming. This pathway shows us how to be ambitious and imagine the big transformation required to have healthier diets and sustainable food systems across the world. This would avert up to 11 million deaths per annum, lift 820 million people from undernourishment, and 680 million people from obesity. And at the same time, that transformation would reduce greenhouse gases emissions by up to 30%. So, of course, linked to my first point, it's to be ambitious. Set this out clearly with pathways and deliver on these ambitions to, of course, deliver not only the Paris Agreement, but also the wider SDGs. And I request, please look at these pathways, They are living documents, so let us know if they are sufficiently addressed gender and know if there can be, of course, improved. Thank you, and looking forward for to learning more during this dialogue. Thanks so much, Daniel.
Muchísimas gracias, Gonzalo.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. Your words are really effective to build a framework for this dialogue. We're so grateful, and we'll take all this in account when we continue this debate. Cesar, I'll ask you to share your screen. And I'd like to pass off the microphone to our experts on the panel and then go into a dialogue. It's a pleasure to be working with this panel of experts, and they add so much wealth and richness to this dialogue. We'll start with Desi Martinez Baron. Especially in the Latin American CGIAR research. She's regional director of Latin America of the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, food, and security. Kate Anna Bowen.
In the team working on humanitarian, climate change, and disaster risk resilience at UN Women, working mostly in the Caribbean. And perhaps I should also say, part of the UN Women multi-country office for the Caribbean. Melania Canales Poma es presidenta de la Organización Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas Andinas y Amazónicas del Perú, ONAMIAP. Igualmente, Melania, mil gracias por participar en el diálogo el día de hoy. Contamos también con Santiago Aparicio, quien es director de la Dirección de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible del Departamento Nacional de Planeación del Gobierno colombiano.
También tenemos Santiago Aparicio, Director of the Environment and Sustainable.
Vivian Solís, Vivian es asociada de COPE Solidar en Costa Rica y parte del grupo mayor de mujeres que representa a la sociedad civil ante las Naciones Unidas. Y finalmente también tenemos la suerte de contar con Jimena Apestegui, quien es asesora a la Dirección de Cambio Climático.
And we are also so fortunate to count
de Costa Rica, así como coordinadora nacional
on Jimena Pestegui, who is advisor of the Director of Climate Change of the Environment and Energy, MINE, as well as the National Coordinator of Readiness Project of the Green Climate Fund in Costa Rica. So this is the panel. Welcome, everyone. We hope that we can turn our cameras on for the panelists so that we can all see each other, and the folks who are listening to us can also see your faces. So we invite you to please do that. And we also, Cesar, if it's possible, to have this slide with the questions in the background. If it's possible, okay. If not, it's okay, because regardless, I'll be asking the questions. Thank you, compañeros, for being here today. I'd like to start with you, Jimena, and ask you the following. From your point of view, what elements of resilience are fundamental to win the so-called race to zero, or the race to resilience? What's necessary to get there, and why? And before you start, Jimena, let you all know that we're asking you to please speak for 2 minutes so that we stay on time. Thank you so much, Jimena. I give you the mic now. Thank you. Well, considering the time, I think I would like to focus on one aspect that I consider is indispensable, and it's considering the topic of knowledge. Truly, we say that knowledge is power, and I definitely think that we need to think about knowledge in different levels. First, in what knowledge is produced for decision making, for a resilient agenda, and also related to who produces that knowledge, and also who do we share that kind of information with, who do we give the access of information. So I think that's a very important discussion, consider it in 2 levels. first, thinking about the perspective of the decision makers, it's very important that beyond, for example, the access to information, scientific information, that's very important, right? It talks about climatic future scenarios, that they also have access to information and that they can also understand the needs of the most vulnerable folks, that there is that information, and to make it available to the decision makers. It's definitely indispensable so that we prevent taking decisions that take us on a maladaptation road where some folks are left behind. Thank you, Jimena, and excuse me to interrupt you for a second, but I got a message from the interpreters to please go a little bit slower. And I apologize because I know that I'm rushing you at the time, but a little bit slower so that they can translate well. Okay, no apologies. I will go a little slower. On the other hand, I'd like to talk about is also the topic of knowledge from the perspective of the most vulnerable populations. So also to think about how, on one hand, what access to information they may have available to make decisions themselves, right, for themselves in relationship to, for example, how they can increase actions to be more resilient. We know that many times, or very often, scientific information sometimes does not flow to the most vulnerable folks. There is no access to that information, or there's no access to strengthen their abilities to understand that information. So it's truly indispensable that that information also flows from the top down and from the bottom up. And even talking about the perspective of these populations, we also give them the space so that they can also have their voices be heard of the knowledges that they do have to offer, a discussion that could happen from a more rational plane, for example, with decision makers from institutions such as the Ministry of Environment. We need to open up those spaces so that the discussion and that flow of information goes in both directions. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jimena. I think everything you said is right on. With the same question, I'd like to move on to Santiago. And Santiago, before we start, I'd like to give a reminder, and I apologize if it seems a bit strong, but I'm gonna take this marker out when you're past 2 minutes in general. I'm gonna show it to you so that you realize that, okay, it's time to end, to finish. So with that, thank you, Santiago. What can you say about the same question that I'm going to repeat it again to our colleagues? What resilience elements are fundamental to win the so-called race to zero or towards resilience? Santiago, thank you. Yes, perfect. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with so many beloved people. It's very special to share this space. Something very important is the value that we must see in the crises that we have going on right now, to truly see what elements have allowed us to have an early reaction. I'm very happy to see the worlds that focus on the risks and disaster measures, because those are disciplines that have protocols, that have an order, and that allow truly to make us act at an accelerated form. So thinking about that big race, the race to zero, I think the first point would be to have that very clear. What can we learn from that? And completely realize that it's having the political momentum and the narrative in the streets is not enough, but we also need to have instruments, political instruments that are very structured. In Colombia, we have a national place of adaptation to climate change. We realized that having the plan itself was not enough. So that's why we're taking the step to consolidating a portfolio that's specific to the most important measures that the country needs to develop. One plan of action, specific, concrete, of how to implement and fund those measures, and systems of information that allow us to monitor and know if the country is effectively becoming a more resilient country or not, and concretely to also start looking at what is the relationship between that resilience of the territory and effectively the advancements of the most vulnerable populations, who are the ones who absorb mainly the shocks, the impacts. Thank you. Thank you, Santiago. Perfect. Absolutely in agreement. And I think the moment of taking action and having ways of taking action is so fundamental. Kayana,
part of this panel as well. And I'd like to pose the same question to you. What does it take to make resilience really something that helps us get to the objective that we are talking about here? Over to you, Kayana.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for the opportunity for having me here today. And in terms of resilience, what it means for the Caribbean is our ability to withstand the impact of a shock and recover to a sense of normalcy, and in some cases, to be in a better position than we were before the shock in particular. So when we are talking about the race to zero, yes, we usually refer to issues such as limiting gas emissions and the aim towards achieving climate change mitigation. Yes, that's correct. However, within the Caribbean region, we're seeing many governments implementing policies that encourage incentives around the importation of hybrid vehicles, for example. But to date, within the Caribbean context, we're seeing more solid examples around climate change adaptation and more projects geared towards that. However, despite the focus on climate change adaptation, they can also contribute to a significant decrease in emissions within the long-term environment. So therefore, in terms of climate change adaptation, the Caribbean has seen an international, regional, and even national focus around developing early warning systems and climate change risk management. For example, we are taking a human-centered approach in conducting a cost of inaction to climate change study by looking at vulnerable populations in terms of both men, women, and even children, to ensure that the national adaptation plans developed in each of those countries are focused in terms of eliminating any gender inequalities and also strengthening capacities within institutions that have the mandate to achieve climate change mitigation. More so, for us in the Caribbean, it's very important to try and associate those possible impacts in terms of dollars and cents. We have to understand the financial costs to be able to find the resources to be able to specifically meet the needs of our vulnerable populations and to be able to mitigate against climate change. That's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Kayana, because you bring that point around the importance of doing both pieces of work, right, around mitigation and adaptation, and also how important it is for both really understand the social impacts, the implications that it has, and how to make sure that the benefit is properly targeted to the populations where it should be going, and ensuring women's empowerment through these measures. So thanks very much for that, Kayana. Y ahora me gustaría pasar a
and
la
now I'd
segunda.
like to move on to the second question of the panel. And I'm going to start with you, Daisy, if that's okay with you. The question for you would be, up until now, or currently, from your point of view, what is the pandemic teaching us in regards to the role of social protection, human rights, gender justice, social justice, in building economies, resilient economies in societies that are resilient? So this sounds very big, but what is the pandemic teaching us so that the next steps that we take in this juncture in which we are the correct ones, the fair ones, allow that these topics are priorities and are front and center in the advancement. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel and discuss these very interesting topics. Well, I think that it is clear that as the demand of food has increased with the population growth, our world natural resources that we depend on are under great pressure. So that's something that we need to be clear about. And with the impacts of climate change, we add the whole topic of the pandemic, well, we are adding additional pressure to our food systems globally. So in that sense, also the pandemic has showed us that we're all vulnerable, right? That social inequality and gender inequality is something that is usual in different rural areas in our region. It truly is one of the factors through which we are even more vulnerable in this pandemic context. And also, through all of this that has happened, we realized that the way towards the development that we know today and that we have been doing for a long time is not necessarily improving everyone's lives, but just a part of the population using the resources that are everyone's. So I think this concept of that we are all in the same challenge and we need to seek solutions that are just and equitable for everyone is something that needs to be considered mandatory in the new models of development that we may have. The Economic Commission of Latin America, CEPAL, poses that 37% of the population in the region will be poor because of the pandemic. That is many, many people that truly need better opportunities, social justice that is much more truly that there is social justice and to have better opportunities for all, basically. That's why coming out of this crisis, it needs states that provide public services that are essential on one hand for everyone, for urban and rural communities, that the production priority production centers like agriculture are supported to strengthen the food systems that are local, national, and global. We are in a world that's interconnected, in which we need to be able to develop mechanisms that increase resilience in different scales.
So women and young people have a really important role. We need to be part of inclusive and participatory initiatives. That's my final message really. We have to transform our system, our food systems, our development models, and all of us can be part of this. All of us can contribute. Thank you so much, Stacy. It's really important what you're talking about, and we're going to come back to this topic at the end of our debate, of our discussion, because as I said in the beginning, we are suggesting here that radical change is necessary to reach our goals. And now, when we are trying to talk about these models of development that are unjust, it's not just these are also agricultural models. These are not just for high above for philosophers or analysts. These are for day-to-day systems that we all work in. So thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to invite Melania. I'd like to ask you about your perspective on these issues in your position as a leader for the Organization of Andinian, Amazonian, and Indigenous Women of Peru. Alania, please. Good morning, good evening, everyone. I'd like to answer this question. The pandemic is showing us that we are like a glass. We are like a cup, a glass. We are vulnerable, but we are also ambitious. Everything is about money and about accumulating wealth. I think it's really important to be conscious of this. And that's what we're doing. We have seen that rights are not rights, they are privileges. And our rights have been privatized because we depend on companies for our rights, and also we depend on governments. Our health, for instance, is in the hands of clinics and pharmaceuticals and pharmacies. All of this is privatized. And with the pandemic in full swing, they have all raised their prices 5 or 10 times. In other words, those who have died during this pandemic, in the majority, are people who did not have money. So the money, it's that. It is not being treated as a right. Health is only something that can be enjoyed by those who have money. It is not treated as a right. The same with education. Children and young people have not been able to access quality education during the pandemic. There have been a lot of people who have left school and studies during the pandemic, and the government has not guaranteed this right. On the contrary, they have privatized this right, creating private universities and schools. So, who has access to the rights of education? Those who have money. State education and public education is completely abandoned. Without infrastructure, without equipment, without professionals. This means that there is no right to education. Education is a privilege. And when we speak about sovereignty and food sovereignty, it is not a right. On the contrary, it is a profit-making endeavor. Governments are displacing us from our territories where we develop our security and our food sovereignty collectively and not individually. The people and indigenous people and indigenous women in our collective territories have developed our knowledge, our wisdom, our practices, our ancestral practices. However, today, in the full swing of the pandemic, the government with fire and blood have kicked us out of our territories. They're taking our territories away, and our food is also a commodity. And that's why we have malnutrition and anemia and all these other illnesses that have increased. Because the right to healthy food is not a right that we enjoy in our homes. Thank you, Melania, for sharing that vision. And I think you're sharing words that are really strong and really valuable. It's really important what you're saying related to the moment that we're living in. The fact that rights are becoming privileges and commodities, and what is the root of all this? To me, it's really important, this question that this pandemic has really shown us. Melania and also Daisy have really gone to the structural problems and how these development systems have revealed these profound errors. We're going to talk about this a little bit more going forward. So we're going to go to the third question, and I'd like to go to Vivian. What I'd like to ask you is, let's talk about some concrete cases. We've been talking about general issues, but let's talk about some concrete situations in which you've worked where we have prioritized human rights, social inclusion, and the rights of women and indigenous populations, how this has promoted to help build better and more effective communities and climate solutions. When we put women in the middle and we say, okay, women and these issues, when we put these in the center, we're going to have greater results. So what can you share with us, Vivian? Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. Before answering your question, I'd like to mention that climate change not only reflects these fundamental problems like other panelists have mentioned, it's also a product of an unjust model of development in terms of this distribution of profits and power. The impact of climate change is also not the same among everyone. There's a difference. In this case, rural women and indigenous women, fisher women, and artisans are most affected. So that's the model of development, and that is really the challenge for us. There are some concrete examples that we can mention. From my experience working with fisher women and artisan women in coastal regions, I would say that whenever, human rights have been eroded and processes where we have seen that justice has been attacked, we've seen the most resilient. So what are these cases? Well, in the recognizing of indigenous communities, just like internationally, we have called these territories, just like Melania has spoken about these territories, we can talk about the Consorcio Tica, the areas in Costa Rica, the women in Brazil, or the Garifuna people in Honduras, or the Mezquito people in Nicaragua. In these communities and territories, these communities have concrete rights. The women who are fisherwomen, the woman who is a farmer, women who are artisans, these are subjects for these in these movements. And they have intrinsic rights, which is fundamental in this case to develop this link, strengthening the tie to the land and to the territory, but also being able to innovate, maintaining this resilience to be able to innovate and face these challenges. There are fundamental parts of this that is important here. So for instance, the commons. Commons are important for women. We can talk about these ideas of diversifying resources, natural resources, more than just what's productive. We can talk about the collective action and promoting community. That's a fundamental idea that helps that resilience, and it is developed by women that are many times invisibilized and silenced and underappreciated in this government that we are confronting, that we are facing. So it feels like the topic of women who should be a subject of rights is a crucial topic in our debates. In these territories, they become actually safe territories when they do recognize in these indigenous communities and local communities that territory, that they're fundamental to develop food sovereignty and protection of natural resources. So what in this case does this have? There are four elements here. Access to natural resources, recognizing our right to the land, the autonomy of indigenous people, and the feeling of belonging. And just like what we talked about before, food sovereignty and cultural identity and models of governance, we cannot move forward without this vision that respects the rights that some extent we have forgotten or we have ignored. These examples, we're talking about equality, equity, and inclusion. Thank you so much, Vivian. You've really shared a lot here, a lot of examples and richness to this dialogue. If I really think about what stood out for me, I would say that the certain aspect of identity, of cultural identity, we have taken a long time to put this in the center in these development models. And we can no longer do that when we move forward because it's really fundamental. First, in terms of human rights, but also in terms of making these efforts effective. So thank you. Kayana?
With you back to English for a moment here. And Kayana, I'd love to ask you the same question from your perspective, from the more Caribbean reality, which also Vivienne shared a little bit about. What do you think? What are specific cases where we are seeing that putting these values at the center is giving us real great results?
Thank you, Danielle. And what we have found in the Caribbean is by using a gender lens, we are inevitably being equitable. And by that, we seek to always have entire community engagement. So both a top-down and bottom-up approach as to how we implement our work across the region. If I did not mention before, we cover 22 Caribbean countries in our work. And what we have seen most recently is that gender responsive budgeting is now high on national agendas across the region. Governments are now being more gender sensitive and gender responsive in their policy making and implementation of projects. So what we have done as the UN Women Multi-Country Office is provide that gender equality mainstreaming training to strengthen the capacity within those institutions at key sectors across the region. So in fact, it will be remiss of me not to mention one of our projects that is currently underway with the IISD, and I'm seeing my colleague Angie online as well, is our knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, and behavior study that is part of the Engender project. Engender is a short acronym for Enabling Gender Responsive Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Resilience. I believe I typed it in the chat earlier, and I also provided a link where persons can read more there. And what the CAP study really aims to focus on is across 9 Caribbean countries to understand any gender biases that persons within those agencies responsible for the climate change mandate, if there are any gender biases there and what we can do to overcome those to improve policy implementation and decision making at that level. I want to give another example. Currently, right now in Dominica, one of the Commonwealth of Dominica, one of the projects we're working on there is called the Human Security Trust Fund. And what we found, for example, post the impact of COVID-19 was a number of the women farmers, they had crops, but due to the restrictions in movement, their crops were beginning to die. So we had to find ways with them to work to be able to still market their crops and sell without those crops going to waste. And what we found was an online platform where persons were able to advertise and they were able to deliver orders upon request, as opposed to being within an open market where they would have been breaching the COVID-19 restrictions. So what we are seeing across the board is opportunities for flexibility and creativity in terms of being gender equitable in our work at both national and community levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayana. And I think that swift in responses is something really important as well, right? We have to be able to do that. Systems have to be able to enable this, because then that's the only way to respond to shocks, like in your example, COVID. And it's also encouraging to hear what you say around governments being more responsive to gender mainstreaming, to putting it in the center. So these are important efforts on a day-to-day basis. So thanks so much for that, Kayana. Para ya empezar un poco a cerrar el...
Now to start closing the debate, I would like to go on to the last question and start with you, Santiago, if it's okay with you. The question would be, well, for example, we have heard a lot about structural changes that are needed, right? Necessary. So what are practical spaces? Because we have already talked about the theory. So what can we do? What are those practical steps to ensure that we are going to, whether gradually or radically, we're going to be coming out of models of development that would help us to create something better, a more just world, a more equitable, as we have been talking about. This, of course, this question comes from, it comes with the premise that if you panelists are in agreement with the idea that we do have to change these models of development. So, Santiago, go ahead. Well, thank you, Daniel. I really like this space. It really is a breath of fresh air. You know, as a public official, you're so overloaded with work and tending to so many matters that are urgent, that are immediate, and not all of them add value to move forward. So this is a breath of fresh air really to be here and to have the privilege of listening to Kiana, Juliana, and Melania. I think that a key word here is the transition. And I think it's seeing how can we achieve, how can we convince and show the opportunity of that, as the sooner that we make the transition, the less heavy the impacts, the shocks are going to be. And in that sense, going back a little bit to the topic of the just transition, how can we make that a just transition, is how can we start showing evidence with data effectively that it's not going to be that the transition is not going timely and fast. If we don't do it that way, it's going to be a lot more costly for all of us. For example, in Colombia, we began planning nationally from the government recently. It's been a whole process of a year to start to link the sector that designs policies of overcoming poverty and extreme poverty and the politics in general of social well-being in the country. We started to involve them gradually so that they would understand truly what are the risks that exist in for the population, that the whole sector works of not moving quickly. And one starts to realize effectively that when you show them the opportunities of acting and the possibilities, and this is the topic of sensibilization is a process. If you create a concrete action, it's like sensitivizing people, making the system more sensible. Excuse me, I think that there is an issue with the audio. I think maybe your mic is too close to you. Can you hear me okay? There? I think it's a little bit better. Yeah, maybe if you can speak a little lower so that there is not like a feedback. I apologize for interrupting you. No, it's okay. Well, so thinking about the practical actions that you mentioned, so looking at the opportunities, practical actions, the way we have done it in Colombia is visibilizing and sensibilizing the public policy makers for them to act quickly and showing them the importance and the opportunities that come up in terms even of recourses of cooperation resources to be able to effectuate their programs. So for example, we're creating a climate change designed for social change. And of course, there is a big participation of women. There is a gender focus in Colombia. For those who don't know, we still have 17 million people who are living in poverty, 5 million people in extreme poverty, and 4 out of 5 homes are led by women. So in that sense, just like those women are heads of household, they have a greater lift in the complexities of climate change, and they are the ones who have a main role within their homes and within their communities. And that's also an important topic. So I would mention those actions, like very concrete actions, specifically to start from the social sector and showing them that not acting now and making the transition creates a great risk of causing a regression of the social indicators. And that's an important topic. The World Bank recently published an research about it. If you don't take the climate risks right now, it generates issues in equity in the region. So I would go from there. Thank you. Thank you so much, Santiago. I think you also bring the topic of the trade-offs, the challenges of advancing in one field and the implications that this may have, like you said, with equity with these efforts. I also think, and I mentioned for the rest of the folks, that what you have talked about, the efforts of Colombia of including the social sector as one of the key adaptation sectors is a very progressive step that has been seen and that we need repeated a lot more. So on my, from me, I also want to congratulate you for that new way of thinking that's very progressive in that sense. There is a topic that I wanted to share, and I think it's interesting, and I was remembering earlier that I was listening to Melania. There is a very beautiful song of Polo Montañez that says, the ones in the front do not advance if the ones behind leave. And I think that's a great phrase, because I think we only advance at the same speed of the last one in the group advances. Like I like to hike, and only one always thinks about that. You advance at the same speed of the last one who is walking in the group. And I think that's something very graphic and very interesting to have that, to keep that in mind. I wanted to share that. Thank you, Santiago. I think we have seen the logo of what our dialogues of our dialogues now. Thank you for bringing also some art into the conversation. Thank you very much. Daisy, well, now I give the same question to you. What do we have basically to do as far as steps to advance these objectives that we have been talking about? Thank you, Daniel. Where the question is very interesting. And I think that, first of all, we need to think in a holistic way. Nothing happens in silos. We live in interconnected systems. Therefore, they are complex and we cannot do it alone. So we need to align our interests to be able to work as a team. Another thing is the permanent co-generation of knowledges. I think that's fundamental. Coming from from research, I think that continuing generating coordinated knowledges with the key actors is very important, and dialogue between rural communities, indigenous communities, and researchers, technicians, decision makers, policy makers is key to be able to truly reach these objectives. And now, being more specific towards the food systems that which is our focus in our work, I'd like to mention 4 key areas from which that we need to be able to transform our food systems in a changing climate. And those, first, to new trajectories in a way that allow radical changes and fast that are necessary to reach our goals. The second is reduce the risk of ways of life, reducing the negative effects of climate viability, and promoting climatic services at a greater scale. Reduce emissions, improving diets, for example, access of healthy foods for everyone, reducing waste and loss of food. That's key to be able to achieve these synergies that we need in resilience and mitigation in climate change. And the fourth, realign the politics, investments, innovation, and support the social movements. I think that here the role of social movements is key to generate those changes that are transcendental. Well, thank you so much, Daisy. Truly, I think that you have hit it right on the nail, right on the head. And now I'm gonna shut up to give room to our colleagues to continue. And also thinking a little bit about the time. And in that sense, I would like to directly go on to Melania. Melania, if you can please tell us a little bit about your perspective in regards to this. Yes, Daniel. Well, I'm going to have some difficulties in my camera, but I'm going to continue speaking. In regards to the question, it's important to guarantee the free self-determination of the peoples and indigenous women, recognized truly by the state and society, and that they allow us revalue our ancestral practices and knowledges and wisdom, that they allow us the good living and also good territorial governance, but in a collective way. That governors allow us and respect our own way of development, and that they don't impose, that they respect this way of development, and they don't, there's a lot of hierarchy, men, women, the ones who have money and the ones who don't, etc., etc. That they stop doing that, and that they stop negotiating with rights. It cannot be a privilege. Rights cannot be a privilege, that they may be only for a few. If it's only for a few, then it's not a right. So this needs to be made transparent. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Melania. That revaluing of the ancestral practices, that focus truly on rights, on that rights may be respected, I think is super important. Thank you so much for your contributions. And I'd like to go to Vivienne. If you could please tell us a little bit about what are the practical steps? How can we make this work? Thank you very much. Now, just a comment on what Melania said. I think that they had made us believe, and I read it somewhere, that there's only two ways of property, the public and private, and two ways of management, the state and the market. And what she says, that collective right is something fundamental that we need to revive, strengthen, and acknowledge. Now, in regards to the question, one of the important things is that we're still in the model that still doesn't allow us to advance in the future. We are not a traditional model. We just did research we do in Central America, and we were able to see there how food is first given to the man, and the woman, even though she's the one who manages the family, it's first given to the man, then it's given to the younger son, and then last one, the food is for the woman. There are changes to be made. We work with OIT, a study with fisher women in Costa Rica, and they are left out of Social Security. They are left out of a decent work, far from having retirement. So this that we're posing here in this question is fundamental. And I would like to do it in two scales. First, thinking about territoriality, rural territoriality, the generation and sharing and the acknowledges of data about gender. I think that's something fundamental that we need to be able to realize that we are in the same system, that we are in the same model, and that women still are in a huge disadvantage. The second element, I would like to strengthen what Melania said. We need to guarantee autonomy and the free determination of the indigenous peoples over their territory. And in that, seeking new governing models that are inclusive and participatory and that recognize that cultural by diversity and ways of life. I share very much the idea of this building of knowledge, but that knowledge has to be traditional and it has to be scientific. And to go beyond, it has to involve the particular knowledge of women to be able to be wholesome and to guarantee that you have the totality of the generation of that knowledge. I also think that governments need to go from a polarization to a balance between production and protection. That means that we need to orient ourselves to sustainability and resources, start handling those resources, and having warranty and access to opportunities for young women. And I think that in Latin America and the Caribbean, that's still an element that has been left behind. Now, thinking more of the generation of public policy and global policy in the water, which is my field. I think in Latin America and the Caribbean, we need gender equity and empowerment of women in the scientific fields who are talking about the sea topics. We see a lot of men in the field about water, but we have not sought those roles that enable women to participate in those making and leadership roles, especially in governing and the handling of the oceans. I think that the last element that I would like to emphasize is to give priority of gender equity and participation of indigenous peoples and local communities on the roadway to generating international agreements. We are in a discussion about the global framework about the handling of the oceans outside of national jurisdiction, and still the participation of women is very little in those debate forums that are international, and much less the participation of communities and indigenous peoples. So I would advocate so that these points that are very clear, that we implement them, as it was mentioned earlier, in a way that is integrated with the whole with all of the sectors, but being very clear on that women's participation has to be done in equity, and that we need to see the presence of their presence in the forums that are making decisions on the governance and the handling of these ecosystems that are so valuable for human existence. Thank you very much.
¿no? Que estamos en esos modelos tradicionales y que falta mucho y que realmente hay que crear gobernanza, yo diría, híbrida para avanzar y esto, vamos a decir, el reto es gigantesco, ¿no? Entonces es importante también ver y saber que estamos ahí bueno, y luchar con más fuerza porque el reto está al grande. Para cerrar el panel...
We need to struggle even more towards this. So I just want to give Jimena the opportunity. Excuse me, the interpreter's on the wrong language channel. We'd like to, how are we going to close this panel from that perspective, Jimena? Yes, thank you. My other colleagues have been very valuable what they're saying, and I just want to talk about public initiatives. So if we think about designing in public policies that are more related to an agenda of climate change, we need to assure that this includes a transition that is just with gender equality and human rights as transverse central themes. I think that's really important and valuable that the two orientative frameworks of the plan to reduce carbon emissions, that this forces the institutions that have roles in this agenda, that when they implement this agenda, they see how they are considering these transverse axes. The citizen participation in policies, design of policies in reducing carbon emissions. So anyone who participates in designing these plans should be having these type of perspectives as a fundamental pillar, more than just being inclusive. In the moment that other public institutions move forward in terms of climate change, they should be considering these transverse perspectives as fundamental pillars. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Jimena and I totally agree with you. And I just want to take advantage of this moment to say that we are working together on a project where we are connecting art with the involvement of the people in terms of mitigation of. We also want to say that in terms of the level of government, there's also some participation in Costa Rica. Thank you, all of you, everyone here. I promised you in the beginning, and I'd like to fulfill my promise, that each of you panelists, you have 30 seconds to close with a few words. We are running a little behind on our schedule, but I do want to give you the opportunity. So we're going to be a little bit strict because we're running a little late. It's optional if you don't want to share, but I would like to encourage you to share. You have 30 seconds, each of you, to give your last thought, and maybe Santiago will sing for us. Okay, well, we don't know. We're not gonna make him, but we'll see. So we're gonna go out in alphabetic order. So if I'm not wrong, I think we start with you, Daisy. Okay, thank you, Daniel. And I hope to be very concrete. I'd like to talk about the power of alliances that helps us to be resilient in reducing carbon emissions. We cannot do anything alone. We have to work together. Recently, we talked about, we organized a dialogue in which we realized the great potential that the region has to carry out changes collaboratively, including different sectors that we need to include to make more sustainable food networks and opportunities for all. Thank you so much. Kiana?
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Danielle. And I am very happy to be part of the panel today. It not only gave us insight here in the Caribbean, but it also gave us an inspiration to know that we are on the right path and there's opportunity for us to continue to push forward in the race to zero. And as I mentioned before, the Engender project, which stands for Enabling Gender Responsive Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Resilience, is first of this kind in the Caribbean. So we are making headway, and as Daisy mentioned, partnerships are important in doing so. So we want to thank you and thank ISD and WIDO on this initiative, and we look forward to working with you in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Kiana. Much appreciated your participation. Thank you. Melania, no sé si usted está ahí todavía. Sé
Melania,
que
I don't know if you're still here. I know you had to leave. You had another commitment. Are you still here? Daniel? Yes, I hear you. Yes. Perfect. I'd like to just say that in order to challenge climate change, the interpreter is having trouble hearing Melania. It's really reciprocity is really important. The harmony between humans and Mother Earth. We cannot destroy our home in order to accumulate wealth, right? So everything that happens to our Mother Earth, happens to us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Melania. I share 100% what you're saying. Thank you for those beautiful words. So if I'm not mistaken, Santiago, I think you're next. What's your message to close today? Thank you, Daniel. I don't have a song today because I'm actually not a singer, but I'd like to remind you all of a phrase from los Paraguayos and our indigenous people on the coast, and a congressperson, they explained to one of the congress people about a law that was being passed. They said, don't forget, reality is created from micro to macro, not from macro to micro. And this is really important. I think we should keep this in mind. Those of us who are designing public policies, or those of us who are policymakers, we need to be clear that policies are a reflection of the micro, and don't pretend and not try to make policies the driving change of a territory. We have to come back to this community-based vision and strengthen these networks, these community-based networks that are really driving change. Daniel says, thank you so much, Santiago. Thank you for wrapping it up in that way and in that direction. Vivian, what would you like to add? Well, I'd like to just say that in Latin America, being young and being a woman, it gives you two challenges. We need to change that. We should advance a vision of equality that allows us not only to race to zero emissions, but also to build a world that is more inclusive and equitable, where women are recognized for what we are, vital actors of development, vital agents. We should build a model that is centered in humans and sustainability of life, where we have autonomous processes for women as central pieces of this development of life. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Vivian, for those beautiful words. And Jimena, I thank you. It's your turn to close once again. How would you close this panel with your message? I would close referencing what you commented, which I also think is really important to highlight. And I haven't commented on it before, but we are calling for an agenda and a transformation that should be able to be able to generate a co-production of knowledge, including everyone, especially those who are not traditionally related to this agenda, like arts, like Santiago, who's talking about the power of a song to transmit a message. It's really important, this call, to show that each person has an important role and an important voice in this new proposal, new model. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jimena, for sharing with this ideal and very true and positive idea of a future. I want to thank you thank you for your dedication, your participation. For us, it's so important to be able to count on all of you, and thank you for giving us so much and adding so much to this space. Thank you so much. We're gonna now pass on to some information that Mara is gonna share. That's gonna help us. This is a poll that we're asking people to share, to fill out. So you'll see this poll show up on your screen. And hopefully you can see it in the language you speak or read. And the first question is, oh no, look, it's in both languages. Great. The first question I'll leave to you and you'll just read it.
¿Cuáles son las barreras claves para poner la igualdad de género y la inclusión social en el centro de los esfuerzos de la resiliencia climática? Y ahí le damos varias opciones.
The first one is, what are the key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts? We're going to leave this up, and then we're going to move on to the next one. Okay.
Could we put the results back up?
Sí, sí, vamos un poquito hacia atrás. We didn't have.
Yeah, let's go back a little bit.
The first answer too much. Let's see if it's possible to. Okay, here we are. Muy bien. Pues la respuesta más.
Very well. So the most common answer has been that the most important barrier is the unequal representation of people and communities in leadership and decision-making spaces, which I think is very much in line with what we have been discussing. And mentioning the second one, siloed approaches to climate changes on one hand, and on the other, like, oh, let's talk about these topics that don't have to do with climate change, apart. No, they're all part of the same, which is what many of our panelists were saying. Thank you so much, Mara. I think we can continue on to the next one. And let's see if it shows up on your screen. There it is. The question is, in what sector or sectors is the greatest opportunity to implement gender and socially just resilience measures that advance the social and gender justice agendas that we have been talking about today. What are those key sectors? Can you choose more than one? Yes, choose as many as you want, as many as are relevant to you.
Ok, yo creo que podemos ir
I
cerrándola.
think now we can close it and let's see what initial results we have. Okay, agriculture. I think it is a topic that has come up in our conversation a lot. So we see that there is great potential as well as water and health. We're talking about them. And another interesting focus is that these are sectors that are mostly directly related to well-being, right? To ways of life. They all are really, but I think that a conversation of adaptation, it's important to look at these results and how we can find potential to touch on these to talk about the progress that we're talking about. Okay, we're gonna close it. Thank you all the panelists so much, and thank you to all the participants. Now we're gonna go to the second and last part of our session today. You're all invited to continue in this process, even the panelists. And this second part is going to be group work. There, I can imagine that maybe you're a bit tired of hearing us. So let's go on to do some breakout work groups. So while Mara does the technical magic so that we only click a button and it sends us off to maybe a small group of 10 people max to talk about these for around 20 minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to present to you the questions that each group is going to be discussing. Every group is going to discuss the same questions, and at the end of the discussion, we are going to get together, depending on the time, to very briefly talk about the result, maybe in one or two um, eh, points. But the discussion is based on these questions, based on today's conversation, of course. The first one is, what are key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts? And the second one is, what changes are needed towards a trend of are needed to realize the transformation towards gender responsive and socially inclusive resilience. We're going to have moderators that are going to support each group, and within each group, also, please do participate actively. And if you then want to give us the feedback, fantastic. Okay, so Mara, I'll wait for your cue or your instructions on what else is needed to go to the breakout groups.
Hello,
I'm going to
everyone.
check my WhatsApp, see if you wrote something.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to open the breakout rooms now. There are 2 rooms in Spanish and 3 rooms in English. If you are in the wrong room, please just let your facilitator know, and they will WhatsApp message me, and I will fix it. So everyone, please be patient. In the next minute, you'll be placed in your room, and we're going to spend a little over 20 minutes there. All right, have great discussions.
Muy bien. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos de vuelta a la plenaria.
Great, welcome back to the plenary session. I think that in the interest of time, and correct me, Mara, if I'm wrong, I think we're going to skip over the feedback portion, and we're going to go to look at the last poll. There were 3 polls, and we only went through 2 of them, so we're going to look at the third poll, then a mentee, and then we're going to close. I hope that that was really enriching conversation. Sorry we couldn't bring feedback here, but we'll have more chances to have dialogue together. Mara, could you bring the poll back to the screen? Great, here it is. So just briefly and directly, let's see. Do you think is the concept of net zero one that supports your idea of resilience? We could talk about this at length, but to some extent, just reflecting on what Gonzalo said in the very beginning, the need to talk about these concepts together, mitigation and adaptation. So we'd love to hear your opinion on this respect. We'll give you a few seconds to answer.
Bueno, Mara, yo pienso que
Okay, Mara,
quizás podríamos ir cerrando.
think that we can close if you have enough answers. Okay. Yeah, it's harder than a yes or no, but it is important. I would say that a third of the group says no. Almost half the group says maybe, but I have concerns. So it's a little bit like water and oil. Like, how do you work on this dynamic to move forward? So let's leave the reflection there. And lastly, or almost lastly, we're going to go back to the Menti. So come back to your phones or your computers and go back to menti.com. Mara shared the link in the chat. So we're going to look at the question here. What key messages around gender and social justice do you hope will come out of the Race to Zero dialogues? There's dozens of dialogues that are going on in these 2 weeks. So what key messages about gender and social justice should be in the closing of these meetings? Let's say the organizers should be talking about or saying the very last days. So let's give them some ideas.
Damos unos últimos segunditos.
We'll give you a few more seconds.
Mi pantalla se ha... no, ok, perfecto.
Okay, perfect.
Bueno, mientras recibimos todavía unos últimos insumos,
so before we get our last input here, we have institutional change. I think it's great that we're talking about inclusive transformation, transformative change, a people's agenda, working with women, working with the people, and really aligned with what we've been talking about. I also see highlighted opportunities, empowerment, but also the topic of justice. In order to achieve that justice, we need institutional change and the movement to modify, to change these institutions to be more or less radical. It's really fundamental. So I think we can close this Menti. Mara, you choose when to close it. Okay. And then, sorry, the next and last question. Oh, wait, I'm wrong. The last question, Mara. Oh, yes, right. Okay. Okay, perfect. So, look, on my behalf, I'd just like to say thank you. An enormous thank you for your patience, for your participation, to be part of this process. I won't take any more of your time. We're already 3 minutes after our time, but I just want to ask for 1 minute to mention 3 or 4 things that I think are important that came out of this conversation. First, a sincerity that we've come to understanding that this is a real challenge. We're not going to kid ourselves. There's a lot of work to do, and the systems are really keeping our hands tied, and even though there are examples of how things are progressing and advancing, I think it's important to really embrace those examples, but it's a system that's really out of tune from what we want that would bring us closer to justice. So I think that's a first really important point, that lack of balance. There are messages also around the efforts to center this work of social justice, resilience. It's also important to mitigate adaptation as well, mitigation and adaptation. But it's also important to talk about equality. Maybe we don't see equality when we talk about mitigation adaptation, but how is it financed? Keeping in balance these two forces is important in order to achieve equity. So a transformation, not only a technical transformation, but also towards justice and equality. It's really important towards hope, where rights come first, where ancestral knowledge comes first. What we were talking about here, a few people who were speaking about ancestral ways of agriculture. Why don't we combine that with current techniques? That union should be done in a way that is more just, sharing knowledge, uniting knowledge, and co-generating knowledge instead of imposing knowledge. We also talked about leadership, the leadership that we bring to these types of conversations should not only be a space where there are more women in this space, but also the style of leadership, a style that is more aligned with these principles of justice, etc. So leadership. And just to close up, one point that we talked about is that many things that we talked about, as Daisy said, talk about the transformation of agro and fishery systems, just like how research is carried out, for instance, can bring us to different paths. So what are those of us who are not scientists, how do we contribute to research that bring about certain results or others? So how to use this knowledge to bring us closer to justice is really fundamental. So these are just just an attempt to kind of gather some of the concepts that have been talked about. Thank you so much. And Mara, I don't know if you'd like to close with a few words. If you'd like to, I invite you. If not, I just want to thank all of you. We'll see you next time. We're going to continue forward and we'll continue to be critical. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Ciao. Bye. Thank you.